Stampede, Reginald Ottley. Chapter 1. Rick woke in the gray darkness. The hell, he thought. What's wrong? A man doesn't wake without reason. He wakes because something he doesn't understand nudges him. He looked over at Mick. Nothing wrong there. Mick's blanket-covered form was motionless. He looked at Joe. Same again, except Joe's blanket had slipped away from one leg. His trousers had rucked up. In the red glow of the fire coals, a foot of bare shank showed. God Almighty, Rick's hair bristled down his neck. The skin crawled on his back. A snake was slithering over the canvas water bag within a foot of Joe's leg. From the way its restless head flickered, the snake was mad with thirst. Rick held his body rigid. He felt his arms quiver. If I move, he thought, the bastard'll rear. He'll set himself to strike. If Joe moves in his sleep, he's dead. Dead as sure as the sun'll rise in another half hour. Rick sweated out the minutes. 2 feet from his hand, a .32 rifle rested on his saddle. But 2 feet can be 2 miles. Even if he had it, there still wasn't enough light. Another 5 minutes, maybe. In the split fraction it takes for an angry snake to hiss twice round a water bag. Rick thought it out. I'll wake old Joe. He's used to being called on a night camp. I'll call him steady and try and get his skull operating before he's fully awake. If I can do that, he's got a chance. If I can't, things are as they are. Joe's saddled his last horse. Rick licked round his lips. There are times when a man can't speak. He forced it out. Joe, Joe. For Christ's sake, don't move. Can you hear me, Joe? For Christ's sake, don't move. The whispered words cut in the night. The snake stiffened. It reared motionless, uncertain where the voice came from. When Joe spoke, it coiled down, ready to strike. Yeah, Rick listened to Joe's voice, smothered under the blanket. I'm awake. What's all this belly aching about? Don't move. Rick closed his eyes. If ever a man ought to pray, he thought, it's now. Old Joe's right. The coot doesn't know what he's up against. But he's right. His brain's ticking over. When he opened his eyes, he saw that Mick was awake. He had his head up, listening. On the other side of the fire, he was out of the snake's sight. Listen, Joe, Rick whispered. You're in a jam, and a tough one at that. You've kicked your blankets away, and there's a snake coiled within a foot of your leg. If you move, he'll fasten onto you, and you've had it. It's a tiger, and you know what they're like. Joe choked into the blankets. The blood pumping in his throat almost strangled him. Why the hell should it be me, he thought. For a minute he panicked. His leg wanted to jump of its own accord. God damn it, he croaked. Kill it, kill it. Rick, bash the bloody thing. Rick inched a hand out of his blankets. His fingers clawed towards the rifle. It was up to him. In a few more minutes there might be enough light. Up to Joe, too. If he cracked, the rifle was a waste of time, except to blow the snake where all snakes should be. On the other side of the fire, Mick watched for every move. Rick's, Joe's, the snake's. His mind registered the drama. What a tangle, he thought. What a one hell of a tangle. He could see the black top of Joe's head. Listen, Joe, Rick can't bash his bloody head. He's got Buckley's chance. He's feelin' for the rifle now. You just gotta keep still. Do you hear me? You just gotta keep still. Rick felt the butt under his fingers. His fingers slid round it. You beauty, keep it out the dust. Keep the bolt clean. Joe wanted to shout, wanted to scream, kick out his leg, do anything, run if he could. The crawling bastard, the dirty crawling bastard. He forced his voice down to normal. I'm right, he whispered, I'm right. But me leg's jumping, every nerve in it's crawling. I can't hold it steady for much longer. Mick shuddered under his blanket. He imagined a snake near his own leg, wanted to look round. Instead he whispered, You won't have to. Rick's got the rifle. He's easing it back towards him. Just a few more minutes and you'll be right. The snake'll be splattered in the dust. Joe ground his teeth. A man can't breathe. I'm choking. I've got to push the blankets away. He balled his hands into knots, felt the sweat under his arms. I can't do it. I just can't do it, Mick. Supposin' he misses. Even if he hits the snake, he's still gonna blow me bloody leg off. No, he ain't. Mick's heart thumped in his chest, but he kept his voice easy. Keep it soothing. You know, Rick, he can hit a bottle at 50, and you're on the right angle. The shot'll go right past you. Now shut up and keep still. Mick watched the rifle slide onto Rick's blankets, saw Rick easing himself for a sitting position. He's right, he thought. Old Rick's right. It won't be long now. Rick saw him looking. Whistle, Mick, he whispered. Just whistle. Whistle through your teeth, like the blacks do. Get him staring at ya. The light's not too good, but I can make it. Mick hissed through his teeth. He whistled on a soft, vibrant note. In his blankets, Joe tightened every nerve, sweated for the report. The snake's head came up. Slowly it lifted from its coils. Its beady eyes glittered over the fire. Mick stared back. You dirty crawler. You dirty, stinking crawler. His mouth was dry. The whistle was getting thin. Rick had the butt to his shoulder. He raised the barrel. His sweaty hand slid under. The sights came into alignment. They lined on the narrow head. Oh Christ, there's not much there. A fraction out, and I've lost him. He squeezed the trigger. The blast slammed away into the distances. The tatter-headed snake danced in the air, then crumbled to the ground. Its head stump beat in the dust. Rick ejected the empty cartridge case and rested the rifle on his knee. Mick pulled on his boots. The two were silent. So was Joe. He rolled flat on his back to stare at the stars. They had almost faded, but he thought they seemed close. Funny about the sky, you never knew what was in it. Someone had to talk. Mick reckoned it might as well be him. He buckled his belt tight over his lean belly and stood up. Come on, Joe, he drawled. You gotta get up sometime. Might as well be now. Y'all get sunburned lying there. Rick pushed the rifle away. He'd been slow in saying something himself. Mick had hit the right note. When a man's had it rough, he wants easing along. You can't push him. He pulled on his own boots. That's right, Joe. The sun's not too far away. We'll put the billy on and have a bit of tucker. Joe rolled his head. The tightness had gone out of his hands, but he felt drained. His leg still twitched. It wanted to jerk up and down. I'm right, he said. Just feel a bit strung up. Mick had no answer for the moment. He stood the billy in the fire, then added a few sticks. When the flames danced, he squatted back. He felt as strained as Joe. Strung up, me eye, he said. What do you think we are? He winked over at Rick. What do you reckon, Rick? I bet the cows leaked in his pants and don't want us to see. Rick creased a grin. A man can crack his face, but he can't hide his eyes. He picked up the snake. Its clammy body wriggled. He flung it as far as he could. I wouldn't blame him if he had, he said. I bloody near wet mine. The snake's body plopped in the distance. Joe scrambled out of his blankets. He jiggled his leg before he pulled on his boots. You know, he chuckled, I never knew before just how much I liked that leg. She's a good bit of stuff, all bone and a yard long. Yard long be buggered. Mick tipped a handful of tea in the billy. Rick carved meat. The whole of ya ain't no longer than a yard. If the flamin' snake had a bit ya, we'd have had to chop most of ya away to make a decent cauterize. Joe hopped on one foot, pulling on a boot. Do you hear that, Rick? To make a decent cauterize. Where'd you reckon he got educated? In a blackfellow's camp. Rick slid slices of meat in between wedges of damper. He passed them round. I'd reckon it was somewhere like that, he said. Somewhere pretty high class. You can tell that the way he holds his little finger out when he drinks his tea. Joe's 5'6" of hardness squatted near the fire. Mick pushed a pannikin of tea into his hand. Here you are, Shorty. Get that into ya. Might help ya to grow. His voice changed. How are you now? Are you right, mate? Yeah. Joe drank the tea, taking it down in great gulps. Rick chewed on a mouthful of damper. The meat was tough. He couldn't swallow the stuff. Yeah, I'm right, Joe went on. You can forget it. But I tell you what, Rick, that bloody bullet went close. She nipped a hole in me blanket. For crying out loud, Mick choked. Do you see what I mean, Rick? You saved a man's life, and he worries about a flamin' blanket. Can you beat that? Rick couldn't. Instead, he thought of what could have happened if he'd shot Joe, or missed the snake. Funny how you start to think about these things afterwards. Makes your hands shake. He stood up to ease his crouched legs. I'll go and run in the horses, he said. Mick stared across the fire at Rick's tall figure, bow-legged out in the dust, against the immensity of plains. His figure looked strangely tiny. You know, Mick said, old Rick's a funny bloke. You never know what to make of him. Maybe you don't, Joe nodded. Maybe you don't. But they don't come any better. Mick emptied the billy in the ashes. The steam hissed round his legs. You're right, he said. Dead right. They don't come any better. Joe spat in the fire. The two stared at the sizzling coals. Mick thought about the snake, seeing it slither near Joe's leg. Joe thought about the shot, waiting for the shot. If ever a man sweated blood, he had. Still, it was over now. He spat again. "You know, Mick," he said, "Old Rick's a decent bloke, and all that, but if he comes back with the horses and finds we haven't packed, he's gonna blast the pair of us." Mick nodded. Rick had just dipped into a hollow. The horses were on the other side. Mick saw their heads fling up, their hobbled legs shuffle in the dust. "He will at that," he chuckled. "He will at that. The coot can rip the hide off a bullock if he gets started. You roll the blankets, I'll stow the gear." Gradually the sun climbed. Under an enormous arc of sky, the two worked from habit. When Rick trotted back, riding bareback behind 30 dust-pounding horses, the pack saddles were ready. In the manner of men familiar with routine, Mick and Joe walked out to meet him, carrying bridles on their arms. While they caught the horses needed for the day, Rick cursed round the outside of the herd, keeping it together. Finally, Mick led 3 horses back to the camp. Joe led 4. "She's right, Rick," he called. "You can let 'em go. We've got enough." Rick rode out of the dust. He slid from his horse. "The bludgers are cranky," he said. "They know they're nearly home." Yeah, Mick already had 1 horse saddled. "The sooner we get after them, the better. I'm getting a bit homesick myself." Joe had saddled a horse too. He swung up a saddle on another. "What the hell are you homesick for?" he grunted. The horse was tall. He had to reach up. "You got ya hat on, ain't ya?" Rick let the bare-backed horse loose. He slapped it over the rump. "Go on, catch up with ya mates." He took one of Joe's horses and led it over to his saddle. "You know, Joe," he said, "you don't understand an educated feller like Mick. Home for him is an association of ideas." Joe finished saddling the horse. It was the last one. He peered over the saddle at Rick. "Is that what it is?" he wondered. "I always thought it was his hat, same as us." Rick shook his head. He put his boot in the pack horse's ribs. "A man needs to strain on a surcingle." "No," he grunted, "nothing like it. You're underrating him, Joe. Home for Mick is that patch of river bank near Yorinda. You know the place where we've camped on and off for the last 4 years. "Oh yeah." Joe put his boot in the stirrup. "I remember now." He swung into the saddle. "He's one of them homin' kind, sort of a bloody pigeon." "That's it." Rick mounted too. "He sticks out his beak and follows it back." Mick let it all pass. The colt he had saddled snorted round him in circles. It wanted to bolt after the 4 pack horses. They had already trotted away. Mick caught hold of the colt's ear and pulled its head down. The whites of its eyes blinked up at him. "If I didn't 'ave hold of this colt," he grunted, "I'd show you where I'd stick your beaks." With the ease of long practice, Mick's legs forked the saddle. The colt balled up. It went so high Rick saw its belly veins. When it came down, Mick was laughing. He had the feel of the colt, knew he could ride it. He swayed up with the colt again. "Come on," he yelled. "I'm headin' for the skyline." Away he went. on a fury of violent horse flesh. Away went Rick, spurring to stay close. Behind him, Joe flogged his horse with his hat. "Stick to 'em, Mick, stick to 'em." Mick stuck all right. He jammed his feet home in the stirrups. This was the life. The wind tore at his face. Dust gritted in his eyes. A man's living when he feels the drive of a muscled horse beneath him. The loose pack horses loomed in front of him. The snorting colt scared them. Mick reined down. "Whoa, boy," he panted. "Now behave ya, flamin' self." Mick wiped his slitted eyes. "The trouble with this country," he said, as Rick skidded to a walk beside him, "is the dust. Look at it. As far as a man can see, nothing but dust." Rick looked. "What's new about it?" he said. Next to him, Joe thudded into a jig-jogging shuffle. The three rode together, side by side. Dust drifted back over them. Sweat caked it in a mask on their faces. Joe's horse pranced, tossing its head. "He's got more legs than a centipede," Joe said. Mick glanced sideways over the mane of Rick's horse. "It's the way you ride 'em," he said. "You got hands like a bricklayer." Joe crossed his hands on the pommel. The hard fingers were permanently hooked to carry bridle reins. He was proud of those hands. The horse he couldn't handle with them had yet to be bred. "You're right at that, Mick," he said. "I must have missed me vocation." "Missed it? Me eye." Mick liked the phrase. He varied it at times. "The only thing you ever missed is yo' weddin'. Ain't that right, Rick?" "Yeah." Rick had his wide-brimmed felt tipped forward. It shaded his eyes. The sun was hot. He could feel it sharp on his back. He had been watching a giant whirly-whirly twist on the horizon. "Yeah," he said again. "That's right. What did you say?" Mick spat over the pommel. "Can you beat that?" he thought. "You ride along with a man, almost talking in his ear, and he says, 'Yeah, what did you say?' But that's the way Rick was. He'd ride, fight, and sink his grog with the next man. Then he'd fold up. You wouldn't know where he was. Never read his eyes." Mick spat again. "It doesn't matter," he grunted. "Joe and me's just fillin' in time." The hours passed. Sweat glistened on the hides of the loose horses. It trickled down the necks and rumps of those they rode. Mirages danced in the distance. The hoof-shuffling hours held a bone-aching monotony. Finally Rick nodded at a steel-wire fence glittering in the heat ripples. "There's the 20-mile paddock," he said. "When we get to the gate, we'll turn 'em in, take 'em down to the river, and camp for the night. We can ride on into Yorinda tomorrow." Nobody answered. They rode on in silence. Presently Joe said, "I'll ride on ahead, Rick. Get the gate open, and be all set to turn 'em in." Rick pushed back his hat. "That's right, Joe. You do that." He looked after Joe's familiar back, rooted in the saddle. "You know," he said to Mick, "old Joe had a close go. A bloody close go this morning." Mick nodded. "Yeah, he did at that." He thought for a moment. "Yah was lucky to get a shot. A snake's head ain't much to get in between the sights." The loose horses saw Joe ride past. Their heads came up. The big pack horse Joe had saddled trotted forward to the lead. Rick watched it. "Yeah," he said, "a man's luck was in. Joe's too, for that matter." They lapsed into silence again. The hooves thudded on. Dust drifted in a cloud. They saw Joe reach the gate. He leaned down out of the saddle to unchain it, then rode through as the gate swung back. He rode out again and waited. "Joe's set," Mick said. Rick wiped the back of his hand across his mouth. He was too dry to spit. When they reached the gate, Joe turned the horses through, then shut the gate after them. On the way down to the stark-timbered river, Joe cantered ahead. Again. "The sod's gettin' around a lot," Mick said. He said it for something to say. Rick looked up. He had been thinking about Yorinda. He watched Joe disappear over a ridge, down to the river's bank. "He's probably gone to look at the river. She'll be pretty low. We'll have to watch where we water 'em." He nodded at the sweaty-rumped horses. "Bog 'em up to their ears if we're not careful." He looked at Mick. "You better go ahead too. I can handle it here. When you and Joe've picked a spot, come back and we'll steady 'em. Get the pack saddles off before we let 'em drink." Mick gathered his reins. "I'll get on then," he said, and cantered after Joe. As his behind settled to the rhythm, he had a thought. The time was still early, a little past midday, he reckoned by the sun. It would be a good idea if, after a drink of tea, they changed horses, then rode across to the gin bar pub. It was set in a bend of the river, about 3 miles away. They'd had some good sessions there before. No harm in having one today. Do old Rick good, cheer him up. He'd have a word with Joe. Joe was all for it. By the time they had unpacked, Rick too was convinced. Wash some of the dust out of their throats. When the billy was dry, they saddled fresh horses. "Get crackin'," Joe panted, hanging his tongue down on his chin. "Me tongue won't stay in. She needs oilin'." Mick laughed. He was halfway in the saddle when he said, "Y'all right, Joe. Me owns about the same." That billy of tea never even touched the sides. They trotted off, easy in their saddles. When they had covered a mile or more of broken river-edge country, the track meandered onto a plain. On the other side, where the river looped out again, the iron roof of Gin Bar Pub shimmered in the sun. Rick leaned forward in his saddle. "You know," he said, looking sideways at Mick and Joe, "this horse of mine's got a lot of toe." Joe was jig-jogging quietly. He began to ease the reins back through his fingers. He knew what was coming. "Has he now?" he grunted. Mick pulled his hat low. "Fancy that. I wouldn't have thought it." "Yeah," Rick went on. "He's got a lot of toe." He sneaked the reins up tight. Mick was watching. So was Joe. The horses began to dance. Heat and dust forgotten, they jerked on their bits. Mick spat on his hands. Joe snapped down his hat. Then they were off. In a pounding smother of hooves and dust, they spurred it for the gym bar. Saddle to saddle, they bumped and jostled. In a sea of plain, they stayed packed together. "Get over, you bastards," yelled Joe. "I'm comin' through." Mick slapped him with his hat. "Comin' through me eye," he screamed. "I'm already through." Rick crouched over low. The pommel pounded in his groin. He was just behind Mick. Dust spewed up in his face. He spat a mouthful. This is it, he thought. This is the life. He flogged past Joe. Hit out at Mick. Get over, let a man through." Mick reined away, then in close again, close to Rick's stirruped boot. Joe came up close to the other. "That's it, Joe." Mick was hoarse with excitement. "Bottle the bastard, bottle 'em right up." They weltered on. Joe slammed a fist into Rick's ribs. Rick backhanded Mick, nearly out of the saddle. Mick came back with a thump that jarred Rick's teeth. They grunted and swore. For the moment they were as mad as hatters. When they crashed into the yard at Gin Bar, sweat streaked down their faces. Dust gritted their eyes, but they were rollicking with laughter. The old man in the doorway watched them dismount. The crazy saddle bashers, he thought. On a stinking hot day like this, they flogged themselves to death. He stepped back inside as the three came in through the doorway. The room was dark and oven-heated from the hot iron roof. The bar stank of stale beer. Rick shook the old man's limp hand. "You know, Clem," he said, "every time I come to this flamin' place, I take one look around and wonder why the hell I did." The old man chuckled. His watery eyes winked. "You come here," he wheezed, "because the next pub's at Yorinda, and that's 20 miles away. And goin' the other way, there ain't one within 50. That's about it." Mick pushed back his hat. The place stank a bit, but what did it matter? Beer is beer, wherever you drink it. He crossed one boot over the other. "Stop ya belly achin', Rick," he said, and to the old man, set us up 3 bottles, Clem, and get a clean cloth to wipe the glasses." The old man hesitated. A tear bulged out of one watery eye. "Ain't I in it?" he asked. "Ain't you gonna shout a man?" Mick slapped money on the bar. "Okay," he said, "but don't get too close. Just ease up the bar a bit." The old man flapped his withered cheeks. The dung scrapers, he thought. They won't want to drink with a man. He bent under the bar. When he straightened, his twitching hands rattled 4 bottles. Joe grabbed them. They were warm. Froth steamed under the caps. "Gotta set 'em easy," Joe muttered, "or they'll blow up." While the old man reached for glasses, Joe eased off bottle caps. Froth oozed on the bar. "Where's the clean cloth?" Mick wanted to know. The old man pulled out a rag. "Here she is. Washed her yesterday." He jabbed it in a glass, jerking it round and round. The 3 watched him. "She's right," Rick nodded. "You win. I'm drinking out the bottle." Mick already had his upended. "Me too," he gurgled. Joe had a bottle in his hand. The cap wouldn't come off. He lipped it on the bar and hit it with the heel of his hand. Glass chipped away with the cap. "You've buggered it," Rick grunted, wiping his mouth. "The hell I have," Joe said, and drank. They squared up to the bar, with the bottles in front of them. They rested on their elbows. Rick was shouldered with a door-scraping wideness. Mick with a drum-chested thickness. The two were of a height. Joe came up to their collarbones. They stared at the old man. Rick asked, "What's new around here? Anything been happenin'?" The old man chopped his gums. Beer trickled from his mouth corners. "No," he said, "these nothin' much new. Some of the boys came in from Coolbong on Saturday and had a bit of a stoush up. Ormond, the overseer, laid out a couple with a bottle. Otherwise, she's been pretty quiet." He upended his bottle, then remembered. "Oh, and a big mob of bullocks went through the day before yestiddy. Camp oven Scotty was cookin' for 'em. He was the only one dropped in for a drink." The others went on. Rick pushed his empty bottle away. "Yeah," he said, "cattle and grog don't mix. It's a bad blue if you twist 'em together." He pulled out a notefold. "All right, Clem, you can slide 'em across." Clem slid them across. When they were opened, he said, "Where you fellas been? You look a bit herring-gutted." "Been on a dry track over to the west," Rick said. "To Yantabulla." Clem nodded. "She's always dry out that way. They never get any rain." He shooed flies off the bar with the rag. They drank in silence. "I guess this one is on me," Joe said. Bottle followed bottle. The sun angled over until it shone in through the door. Mick wiped his sweating neck. "God damn it," he said. "What do you build the pub this way for? You should have had her facing north or south." The old man twitched jerkily. "I didn't build her," he said. "She was here when I came." His hand wiped across his chin, then flopped on the bar again. "She's a good pub. What's the matter with it?" Mick didn't tell him. He had had enough. So had Rick and Joe. "Let's get to hell out of it," Rick said. "The bloody beer's getting hotter." He pushed away from the bar. "I'm right," Mick said. "I'm right when you are. How about you, Joe?" Joe had made a pattern of rings with a bottle bottom. With a sudden movement, he flung the bottle out the door. "Yeah," he said, "let's beat it. Get a bit of fresh air. The dump stinks." The old man jittered on his feet. "You can't do it," he spluttered. His tongue clung to his gums. "You can't do it. You can't leave a man alone. The ain't a fly in the place that's fit to drink with." Rick tucked in his shirt. His hand came away wet. "A man's sweating like a pig," he said. "You'll be right, Clem. Shout yourself a couple and snore it off." He went out through the door. Mick stopped halfway. "Yeah," he added, "and the next time we come in, clean the place up a bit." He winked at Joe going past him. "Get her all set to entertain us." "Entertain ya?" The old man hopped round the bar. "What the hell you want a man to do? Strip and give you a dance?" Mick stepped out through the doorway. Joe had followed Rick to the hitching rail. The horses were hang-headed at their bridles' ends. "Yeah," Mick said, "that might be an idea." He walked over to the hitching rail, laughing. They rode out from the yard, early, easy in their saddles. The old man danced in the doorway. "So long, Clem," they called. "Well, see you next time." The old man waved the rag. the dirty scrub chasers, leaving a man alone. He went back into the room, shooing the flies from the bar. He bent down for a bottle. Away from the yard, the three rode quietly. Rick pushed back his hat. Joe did the same. Mick slouched in his saddle against the skyline, a mirage mirrored in the dust. Under their horses' hooves, the sun-baked ground powdered into more dust. "You know," Joe said, to break the silence, "when we left camp, I was all set to hit it up, but she sort of went flat on me." Rick rubbed a hand down his chin. The beer inside him had fought a losing fight. All it did was push out his belt. He spat over the pommel. "That's the way it goes," he said, "and while ever this country's big, hot, dry, and dusty, she'll always be the same." Mick stretched himself upright, easing out his legs. The stirrups glistened on his boots. "That's about it," he yawned. The beer had made him sleepy. He shook his head to clear it. "That's about it, and she'll never be any different." Chapter 2. Rick shaded his eyes from the sky glare. The brassy sun blinded him. Ahead, a cluster of iron-roofed houses shimmered in the heat haze. "Well, there it is," Rick thought. "This time yesterday it was Genbar. Today it's Yorinda, the town a man calls home." He spat over the pommel. Spittle splashed in the dust. "There she is, Mick," he grunted. "Every last sun-baked shack of her." Mick eased the hat from his sweat-wet forehead. "Goddamn, the sun, it was hot. A man could roast a bullock in it." He licked his lips. The dust tasted of mud. "Yeah," he said, "I've been looking at her. She's all wool, and a yard wide. It's gonna be good to spell up for a day or two." Rick eased his behind in the saddle, felt the galls, scraped on his legs. "It will at that," he said. "We'll make it a week or more if we can. It'll all depend on Dawes. A man has to take as they come." He rubbed the neck of his shaggy-maned horse. The hand came away wet. He wiped it on his trousers. "The hell," Mick said. "The way you stroke that nag, you'd think you was stroking a filly, a two-legged one." Rick again combed his fingers through the mane. Sweat trickled underneath. The horse tossed its head. White showed in its eyes. "Maybe I thought I was," Rick said. "But with you and Joe around, a man doesn't get much change." Mick chuckled. He tipped his hat forward over one eye. "The hell," he thought, "if a man did all the things he thinks about, he'd flog himself to death." "Don't give me that," he chuckled. "Every time we're in town, you have to beat 'em off with a stick." Rick, too, tipped his hat. The brim shadowed his face. Heat beat up from the ground. The shirt clung to his back. "Maybe I don't know," he grunted. "Maybe I do. But it ain't from me. It's from you and that little stumpy-tailed Romeo jigging around up there." He nodded at Joe, riding lead in front of the loose horses. Joe looked back. He held up 2 fingers. Rick saw them through the dust, over the sweaty-backed horses. "Can you beat it?" he said. "The maggot size must have heard me. He wants someone to give him a hand. They're crowding up on him. You'd better canter ahead." Mick gathered his reins. Joe was a good 100 yards away. The loose horses strung out in between had scented Yorinda, smelt the water on the other side, where the river bent in. They're right, Mick thought. They know the place as well as we do. They'll flog the last half-mile in a smother of dust. He nodded back at Rick. I'll get on them, he shouted, already cantering his horse. But keep your stick handy. There might be some girls around. The horses gained momentum. Their iron-hard, unshod hooves thudded in crescendo. Mick and Joe, trotting in the lead, swore at the horses' eager heads. Rick, trotting in the rear, swore at their sweating rumps. God damn them, he thought. If they don't take it steady, we'll smother the flaming town. Dust climbed up in a pall as the track merged into Yorinda's main street. The horses clattered past the Rond Hotel first, then in between a double row of awninged storefronts. Joan Sinclair, standing in her freshly painted doorway, heard the thunder of hooves, saw the press of jostling, sweat-streaked bodies. She stepped forward excitedly. Goodness, she thought, this is what I came to the back country to see. This is the kind of life I always imagined. She half waved her hands. Dust from the horses billowed round her. Mick, reining on his eager, plunging horse, saw her bright, frocked figure, saw her face, with its mass of tumbled hair. His whistle brought Joe up to a bone-jarring stop. Joe slewed in the saddle. God damn it, he choked. What's wrong with you now? You sound like a bloody canary. Mick jerked a thumb. Joe stared, slit-eyed. Sweat trickled down his cheeks. Christ, he said, and jerked his hat. Sorry, miss. We're in a hurry. They spurred on. Flattened behinds set tight in the saddle. The loose horses flowed after them. Rick, raw-eyed in the rear, cursed them for checking. He didn't see Joan. You lousy saddle scrapers, he shouted, standing in his stirrups. Keep 'em moving, keep 'em moving. Mick and Joe couldn't hear him. The rattle of hooves and snorting whinny of horses behind them drowned his voice. But Joan heard him. Jim Dawes, the cattle agent, officed 20 yards along the street from her cafe, came bulky-bodied towards her. He was laughing. Rick, skidding his horse at the veranda's edge, saw him. He waved a dust-coated hand. "How are you there, Jim?" he yelled hoarsely. "I ain't got time to stop." He jerked his hand at the horses crushing together ahead of him. "The bastards are lively. They want to get down to the camp." His horse snorted angrily, wanting to follow its mates. It plunged after them. "So long," Rick called. "I'll see you later, maybe tonight." "So long, Rick," Dawes shouted too. Rick's swaying figure was already halfway down the street. "I'll look out for ya." Dawes wiped his gritty face with a handkerchief. He dusted his white-shirted shoulders. God, he thought, it's a wonder they don't die of it. Choke right up. He walked heavy-footed towards Joan. Dawes had been a good horseman, but age had thickened him. Money, too. He liked the feel of a car cushion under him, not the stiff leather of saddle. His legs merged with his body in a solid bulk of meat. He smiled down at Joan. "You don't want to mind their language," he chuckled. "They don't mean anything by it. It's just second nature to 'em." Joan liked Mr. Dawes. In the week she had been in Yorinda, he had been a great friend to her, helped her in her strange surroundings. He was one of the powers behind the town, or so she had heard, a good man to have for a friend. She looked up at him, infected by his smile. "I don't," she laughed, but the one at the back did use some dreadful language. But she added, "I don't think he saw me, or knew I was here." Dawes noticed how pretty she looked, clean and sweet, in a land of dusty, sweaty men. Makes a man wish he were young, he thought, lean in the saddle, like Rick. He wiped the handkerchief round the fat fold in his neck. "That was Rick," he said, "Rick Selden, a nice feller." The other two were his mates, Mick Shane and Joe Garrett. Joan stared down the hot, dust-hazed street. The dust almost obscured the horses. She could see Rick tailing in behind them. They surged round a corner. Buildings hid them from sight. She looked up at Dawes. "Where are they going?" she asked. "That's the way to the river, isn't it?" Dawes had swiveled his big bulk to look after the horses, too. "Yeah," he said, "they'll take 'em over the bridge on the river and camp on the other side. Rick's always used the one spot, ever since I've known him." Joan thought again about the horses pounding past in the roadway, their shaggy manes and tails, their wild-eyed snorting and whistling. She wondered about the men. "What do they do?" she asked Dawes. "I mean, I know more or less. Everybody in this part of the world has something to do with cattle." But she wrinkled her forehead. "I don't know how they do it." Dawes touched her arm with one hand. With the other he opened the cafe door. "The hell," he thought, "a man'll sweat to death standing out here. She looks as cool as lettuce, but I'm damned if I am." "Let's go in," he said, "and I'll be a customer. You can make me a pot of tea." Joan laughed. His great bulk dwarfed her as they went through the doorway. Inside she felt the shadowed coolness. It ran cold fingers on her arms, on her face. "I didn't notice it was so hot out there," she thought, "until I came inside." She pulled out a chair, smoothed a cloth. "You sit here," she said, "while I make the tea." She made the tea. And behind the short counter she watched Dawes ease himself down, heard the chair creak as his behind spread out. "Goodness," she thought, "I'll have to get him special ones. He'll break these." She brought round the tea. "There," she said, "now you can tell me about those men and their horses." Dawes chuckled. There's women, he thought, always got their eye to business. And good business at that. God damn it, I wish I was young. He poured tea into a cup. "Well," he said, "there's not much to tell. They're cattle drovers. Rick's the kingpin, although they're all more or less partners. Own the horses between them. For the rest, you might say they're good. Probably the best there is in these parts, if not the best in Australia. And crackerjack horsemen, the three of 'em." He nursed a cup of tea. The cup was lost in his hands. Joan fussed round the room. It was small. She had to sway in between the tables. Two more dusty-shirted men came in. They scuffed chairs back against the wall. She served them tea. Tea, she thought, that's all they drink, and eat ham and eggs. She looked over at Dawes. Sweat glistened on his face. The back of his shirt was wet. Poor man, he looks uncomfortable. "He's too big for this place. But where do they live, she asked, when she was back by his side. I mean, when they're not with their cattle. When they're here in Yorinda. Dawes set down the cup. He had forgotten about Rick. He was thinking about the two lean-faced men, back rested against the wall. The mongrels, he thought. The dirty, crow-faced mongrels. This is no place for them. They ought to be gut-swilling in the Rond Hotel. Dawes lidded an eye up at Joan. Never mind about Rick, Joan, he said softly. He camps by the river. He half glanced back over his shoulder. But watch your step with those fellers. That's the worst two men in town. They're the Dennis brothers. Beda and Dan. Joan pretended to smooth the cloth. She could see Dawes was serious. His heavy paunched body had braced into rigid firmness. The lines on his sweaty brown face deepened. She smiled down at him. Don't worry, I'll watch my step. Anyway, they won't bother me. I can take care of myself. Maybe you can. Dawes finished with the tea. He pushed the cup away, but out here's not like down in Sydney. Oh, we're civilized, and all that. We've got a sergeant of police, and a couple of constables. But it's still not the same. You'll find out, he added, if you stay long enough. Joan glanced round the room. The two brothers watched her. One whispered something to the other. Their faces creased in hard-lined grins. Aware of their eyes, Joan felt her back tingle. I shall stay, she said to Dawes. You can count on that. Dawes nodded his head. The hair was cropped to bristle shortness. I hope you do, he said. I hope you do. He fumbled in his pocket, slid money on the table. That ought to cover it. Joan shook her head. No, she said, it's too much. I'll get you some change. Like hell, Dawes started to say, then changed to, no it isn't. I owe ya for the other day. He pulled his hat from under the chair. But seriously, Joan, any time you've got some strife, you know where I am. My office is just up the street. He pushed up off the seat. One great hand flattened on the table. Now don't forget, will ya? Joan smiled as he stood looking down. She felt warm inside. It's good, she thought, to know someone like Mr. Dawes. He's like a great rock, weathered by time. She followed him to the door. No, she said, I shan't forget, and I shan't ever be able to thank you enough for all your kindness. Dawes pulled open the door. Heat beat in from the pavement. Dust drifted from a passing car. There's not much you have to thank me for yet, Joan. But maybe you will. And that'll make me happy. Half through the doorway, he stopped and looked back. Joan's hair glinted in the light. You see, Joan, he said, I like guts, and you've got plenty. He let the door close after him. Joan walked back to the table. She took away the crockery. Behind the counter, the room felt narrowed in. With Mr. Dawes there, she had not noticed the Dennis brothers, or hardly. Now their lean, hawk-boned presence seemed to dominate the place. I wish they would go, she thought, or someone else come in. The one on the right looks vicious, evil. It was Bidet, hat tipped back on his head, a thin line of sweat dust marked on his forehead. He rolled a cigarette, slitting his eyes from the smoke. The hell, he thought, she's a nice filly. A man don't often see her sort. More to her than the drab-tailed sluts on the river bank. A man could do worse than see what was under her dress. He nodded at Joan. "You got a nice place here," he said. "You cleaned it up a lot. Bit different now to when old Miss Higgins had it." Joan made her voice curt, cut the word short. "Yes," she said. Damn him, why didn't he look away, instead of stare at her? She bent down behind the counter to fumble with some of the crockery. When she straightened, her hair tumbled on her face. She brushed it back with her hand. Bidet's eyes were still staring. His brother's too. God, Bidet thought. There's hair for ya. Like the mane streaming down the neck of a Brumby filly. "You don't have to hide," he said to Joan. "We ain't gonna throw ya." His brother laughed. "The hell we ain't," he chuckled. He said it softly, but Joan heard him. Blood flamed in her face. "What do I do now?" she thought. "Tell them to get out or what? This is why Mr. Dawes warned me." She looked down at her hands. They were twisted together. She eased the white-knuckled fingers as feet grated on the pavement. The door opened. A man and a woman came in. The woman smiled at her. The man stood awkwardly, on legs bowed to a circle. He slid the hat from his head. "Good afternoon, my dear." The woman smiled. "Could we have some tea?" Her eyes had a tired quietness. Wisps of sun-faded hair etched round her face. Joan breathed a sigh through her lips. She hurried round the counter. "Certainly," she said. "Where would you like to sit?" She pulled back a chair, relief flooding in her. Would here do? The table she indicated was in front of the Dennis brothers. That will keep them quiet, she thought. Maybe they will go. The woman nodded. Her glance flickered over the brothers, rested on Bidet. Contempt glittered down at him. Then she took the chair Joan offered. "Yes, thank you, my dear." She smiled up at her. "It will do nicely." The man held a tight-lipped silence. He scraped back a chair. Joan made the tea, set it on the table. She felt the brothers' eyes following every move. The woman pointed to a chair. "Won't you sit down too?" she said. "My husband and I like company." The man fumbled with his hat before stuffing it under the chair. "That's right," he drawled. His voice had a sure-toned quality. Joan sat down. The woman poured tea, holding the pot with a full-veined hand. The fingers widespread from work, but well kept. She passed a cup to her husband. Her eyes smiled back at Joan. "We saw Mr. Dawes this morning," she said. "He told us about you. We thought we would call in to meet you." The man had a cup to his lips. He looked over the rim at Joan. "That's right," he said. Joan felt their kindness. It flowed out from the woman's gentle tiredness, shone in the man's sunburnt face. "Thank you," Joan said. "It's very kind of you. I don't quite know what to say." The woman patted Joan's hand. "You don't have to. Out here in this great desert of a country, people have to be friendly. Otherwise, it is too lonely." Too full of heartbreak. She slowly sipped her tea. The man set his cup on the table. "Yea," said, "it is at that. I think it's wonderful, though." Joan said it uncertainly. She felt the woman's face held too much knowledge of the land and its loneliness, its heat and dust. It's fascinating after you've lived in a city all your life. The woman smiled. She almost repeated what Dawes had said. "I'm glad you do," she said, "and I hope you always will. But that's one of the things we spoke to Mr. Dawes about. He's worried about you, you know," she added. Joan laughed. "He's a dear," she said. "I had a letter of introduction to him from Sydney. He met me at the mail coach. Helped me get straight in here." She waved her hand at the room. "I know." The woman poured fresh tea, then laughed at her own forgetfulness. "Oh," she said, "I haven't told you who we are. I'm Linda Shawcross. This is my husband, Bill." Bill's wide-set eyes smiled. "The hell," he thought, "she's a nice kid. I'd have liked one like her for a daughter." "Pleased to know ya," he said. The woman went on. She too liked Joan, liked her fresh, laundered prettiness. "We own a station about 100 miles from here, a cattle station. We thought that after you've settled in here—" Her glance shifted round the room, rested on the Dennis brothers, then moved on again. "You might like to visit us any time you like. It would at least make you feel that you have friends." Joan felt overcome. Her eyes widened. "Goodness," she thought, "they've only known me a few minutes, yet they invite me out to their house." She guessed Dawes had had something to do with it. That would be something I've always wanted to do, visit a cattle station. Then she remembered the distance. "Oh, but it's so far away. I couldn't walk all that distance." She laughed, looking at the woman. Bill Shawcross cleared his throat. "God damn it, a man's lost in their petticoats. He's better off out on the plains, with the sun roasting his hide." He leaned back in the chair. "You won't have to," he grunted. "I'll send in a car. We've got 4, he added. Joan forgot the Dennis brothers, even forgot the cafe. She saw the plains stretch out into heat-miraged distances, felt the hot wind beat in her face. She was almost breathless. "That would be wonderful," she whispered. "Too wonderful to be true." Bill Shawcross watched her face, guessed at the expression passing over it. "Well, it ain't," he said, "so we'll leave it at that." His wife nodded. She brushed a wispy strand of hair from her face. It would be nice to have Joan stay with them, to talk women's talk with her. In a world of men, cattle, and horses, she missed it, had done all her life. Besides, it would make snakes like the Dennis brothers realize the girl had friends. Good friends. She tucked the wisp into place. "Yes," she said, "now we'll forget about it, and have some more tea. When you're ready, you can let Mr. Dawes know. He'll ring us on the phone." Bidet Dennis listened. He knew they wanted him to listen. For crying out loud, he thought. The old girl's riding herd, keeping the filly yarded. A man'd break a leg getting her out of it. He slammed to his feet. "The hell with this, Dan," he said. "Let's get out on the street. My guts are spillin' tea." Dan reached his feet the same time as Shawcross. The cattleman's face hardened into rock. His eyes glowered across the table. The force of a man who owns 1,000 square miles of land was in them. "You're a foul-mouthed swine, Dennis," he grated. "We came in here to stop ya. Now get out before I ring the police." Bidet pushed wide-shouldered past the cattleman. A big vein pulsed in his throat. "God," he thought, "I'll choke. I could kill the old bastard. Screw his head round on his neck." He barely whispered when he said, "The hell ya will. This is a public cafe, and thain't no one can keep me out." Shawcross kneed the chair back behind him. He had control of himself now, his hands gripped at the table. He felt sorry for Joan, frightened-eyed beside him. "Maybe it is." His voice was as low as Beday's. "But I'm warnin' ya, if you come in here again, I'll break ya, have you drummed out of the district, and you know I can do it," he added. Beday jerked down his hat. The old sod was right. If he tightened the screws, not a man would employ him. The police would sit on his tail, stay with him till they had him, then slam the door. "The hell with ya," he said, and went out to the street. His brother shouldered after him. The door thudded. Shawcross eased his hands from the table. The cloth bore their heavy imprints. "Phew," he said, "that was close. I thought he was going to crack." His face softened down at Joan. "Then you'd have lost some furniture. Had it busted into sticks." Joan found it hard to speak. The sudden violence had startled her. Her first few days in Yorinda had been quiet. She had been occupied cleaning the cafe, stocking it. Now, on the first day it was open, this row had flared. "What do I do now?" she thought. She felt the woman's hand in hers. The fingers pressed softly on her own. "Don't worry, my dear," Miss Shawcross said. "It's finished with. I don't think they'll bother you any more." She looked up at her husband. "Do you, Bill?" Bill rubbed a hand on his cheek. He could see the confidence in his wife's eyes. The worry in Joan's. "The hell of it is," he thought, "with cow dung like the Dennis brothers, you never knew where you were. It's easy enough to threaten, but hard to carry out the threat. A man can pull the reins on a bolting horse, but he can't stop it. The best thing to do before leaving town tomorrow would be to have a word with the sergeant. Dawes could look after the rest." He smiled down at his wife, rested his hand on Joan's shoulder. "No," he said, "forget all about it. Now that they knew where they stand, you'll find they won't bother you." Well, he reached under the chair for his hat. "We'll have to be pushing along. I've got some business in the store to tend to. If I don't get rations for the men, they're gonna be trouble." Joan stood up. She felt relieved, but some things still puzzled her. "What I can't understand," she said, "is how you happened to come in when you did, and your wonderful invitation. That's really floored me." Miss Shawcross chuckled. She set the wide-brimmed straw hat more firmly on her head. "You see, my dear," she smiled, "we were on the street, just outside our hotel, watching Rick Selden go by with his horses. He'll probably be shifting some cattle for my husband within a week or two, and after that they had gone past. We thought we'd like some tea, or rather I did, so we came along to you. Mr. Dawes had told us about you reopening this cafe, and in his office we had already planned to invite you out to our place. So there you are." She moved towards the door. Her husband walked. Bow-legged after her. "Yeah," he said, "so there you are." At the door he held out his hand. Joan's rested in the calloused palm. "You see, Joan," he said, as his wife smiled round his shoulder, "you may have heard that things move slow in the back country, but they don't. We judge and condemn quickly. Dawes has known you a week. That's long enough." He freed Joan's hand. "And that's a long speech from me," he added. Miss Shawcross went through the doorway. Her hat ruffled in the wind on the street. "Goodbye for now, my dear," she said. "We'll see you tomorrow, before we leave." "Goodbye," Joan said.